One of the great philosophers on whom I do a good bit of scholarship and also have taught a number of times is Thomas Hobbes, one of the, I consider him, fathers of early modern philosophy. A lot of people would say that Descartes is the father of modern philosophy, but I would say that Hobbes certainly deserves to be called the second father of a new way of doing things. And although I am a Hobbes scholar, in that I've published quite a few pieces on Hobbes over the years, I'm not a Hobbesian. That is, I'm not somebody who puts him forth as the way in which we ought to view things. As a matter of fact, I'm attracted to Hobbes in part, and I'll tell you more about this a bit later, precisely because I think that he shows us how things could go drastically wrong, not only in his own times, but in the 21st century and also as they did in the 20th century. So I'm not a Hobbesian, but I am, you could say, in some respects, a Hobbes admirer, but also somebody whose admiration is mixed with fear. And you can tell just how much I read and reread Hobbes, because this is my everyman's version of Leviathan. I'm not sure where the back bit went off to. I mean, all the words are still in there. And admittedly, I don't really read much in part 3 and 4 in the Leviathan. But parts 1 and 2, you see they've gotten quite a bit of use out of them. There's a ton of underlining and re-underlining in many different colors in here as well. I first started reading Hobbes, I think, if I'm recalling this right, back as an undergraduate at Lakeland College, now Lakeland University, which, side note, no longer has a philosophy program. There weren't a lot of us in philosophy at the time, but I had to read them for a modern philosophy class, and I don't remember being particularly impressed by most of what I was reading. It was in that Kant anthology, so it wasn't the totality of Leviathan. I did enjoy, reading his depiction of the state of nature. I found, his diction a bit difficult myself to read, but that was just because I hadn't gotten used to his own way of talking. A lot of times when we have ancient and early modern authors in translation, because the translators will make them as up-to-date as possible, those translations are sometimes a bit more readable than 16th, 17th, 18th century literature. And so Hobbes suffered a bit from that, for me at least. As I started, thinking more and more in terms of political philosophy and reading the Leviathan as a systematic document, which is what Hobbes intended for it, not just looking at this chapter or this chapter by itself, but looking at the totality of what he was putting together, I found myself becoming more and more impressed by Hobbes' thought. He was somebody who was a staple. I taught him many times early on. As a matter of fact, I think the very first time that I got to teach him, I was still a graduate student. I was teaching a class on philosophy, politics, and justice, or perhaps maybe it was philosophy of politics, law and justice, or something like that. But Leviathan was something I had my students read, and then I would actually use it in quite a few ethics classes, as well as classes on 19th century philosophy or intro classes where I wanted to get the students to grapple with some classic political philosophy. And I found myself struck by the scope of his thought and by its implications, particularly for conflict in the present. So, over the course of time, I ended up doing quite a bit of presenting, and some of those presentations got turned into articles. One of the ones that I had early on was in this journal, Acta Philosophica, and that's the laws of nature as moral norms in Hobbes' Leviathan. That ended up being turned into a forum because some of the people who were involved with Acta Philosophica thought that my reading of Hobbes was a little bit too radical, and they disagreed with it, so we had a scholarly debate about that also in Acta Philosophica. I'll put links to those, that article and then the forum discussion about it here. And then I published another one in Philosophy and Social Criticism. This one was called Reason is Danger and Remedy for the Modern Subject in Hobbes' Leviathan. And in it, I was arguing that Hobbes is particularly important to read because he articulates this situation that we're caught in. And one of the ways in which people will often view matters, and then sort of he provides a solution, which is a solution that many people have taken, and it's a solution ultimately of totalitarianism. Hobbes was struck in part by the need for social order in watching an English Civil War unfold, and that English Civil War ended up producing what's arguably one of the first early totalitarian societies. Thankfully a fairly short one. And Hobbes is writing, in response to that. You can take out a lot of his sort of, references to early modern politics and the ins and outs of the English scene and apply it in a much larger sense, and you can get this sort of look. It's either anarchy or it's a poorly functioning society in which there really isn't any justice and it's just force, and things are going to fall apart sooner or later, or they're just going to keep on going through, and new elites are going to replace old elites, engaging in ideological conflict with each other. Or you can have this well-ordered society of the sort that I'm setting out, which, by the way, is going to have to be enforced by authority, which will extend not only to what you do, but what you think or what you teach. Hobbes thinks that all of this can be set out, and this is something that's very revolutionary about Hobbes. He thinks all of this can be set out in a form of a new social or political science, what he would call moral science, right? And this has been an attractive prospect for many people. A lot of people want to say, that Nietzsche should be the person that we look to about how things could go wrong and all that. I actually think that Hobbes is, in a certain respect, more apropos, more influential, even in indirect ways than Nietzsche is. He shows us how these dilemmas can work out. So one of the other things that I wrote, which never ended up getting published, was for a volume that a colleague was working on, and it had to do with contemporary African politics and how to avoid falling into Hobbesian dilemmas. Because when there is not a strong civil society, and there is a history of, revolts and power struggles, and not only, in terms of like the political system, but you might call it the cultural or ideological system also gets involved. So there's no way to take a objective, although everybody's saying they're objective, there's no way to take a purely objective stance. It's easy to see why things that look similar to Hobbes's commonwealth would be where things would go. And I think that usually can't be realized. Totalitarian societies are in many respects even worse than the anarchic, breaking down, unfair, unjust societies that they are used to replace. But you can see why that sort of thing would be attractive. So I think that, and I still think this today, I just haven't had the time to do much follow-up scholarship on Hobbes. I think that Hobbes is actually outlining a fundamental human problematic, one that becomes particularly acute in modernity and continues through. So I rank him actually up in the thinkers of the first rate, and I look at this book, Leviathan, as one of the great works of Western philosophy that everybody should read. I do have a few other things I've published here and there on Hobbes. One paper that I don't know if I'll ever get it reworked and sent out for publication on Hobbes, and there was a discussion about could he actually be a virtue ethicist, and I said, well, he does talk about virtue, but if he is a virtue ethicist, it's in a very different way than other virtue ethicists would understand that to be. Maybe I don't know, I'll see if I'll send that out sometime. Right now I consider it to be an orphaned paper, but I did publish another piece about the 5 states of nature in Hobbes' Leviathan. I think that there's a number of different ways that he construes the famous state of nature, and I provide an exegetical argument for that. So I'll put a link to that as well. You might find that interesting. I gave that to a new online journal that was looking for papers. So in any case, that's a little bit about why I think people should study Thomas Hobbes, why I think his ideas are worth examining and thinking through. Again, I'm not endorsing him. I don't agree with him. As a matter of fact, he kind of makes me worried as I read through the stuff. But I have a kind of fascination with this mindset that he articulates and how well he's able to address a lot of issues that come up. And so I see him as somebody whose ideas, whether coming directly from Hobbes or formulated in other ways, because other people can arrive at similar ideas, will be attractive to many people in situations of intractable social and political conflict and ideological conflict. And so I think it's very important to look at him and to think about how we would move past this, where the weak points in his arguments are. But all that said, I really enjoy working on him. I really enjoy teaching him. And I probably will continue to do both of those over the course of my career.